The transport shuttle broke through the violet clouds, and Kyle Morrison pressed his face closer to the window. Below him stretched a city that looked like it was made of dreams and glass. Towers of crystal reached toward the sky, glowing with soft blue and green light from within. The streets curved in patterns that seemed impossible, and everywhere he looked there was beauty that took his breath away. This was Zal Thara Prime, the home world of the Viridian Empire. Kyle had seen pictures and videos during his briefing, but nothing prepared him for the real thing. The city looked alive, like the buildings were breathing with light. He had grown up in Detroit, where factories filled the sky with smoke and everything was gray and practical. This place was different. This place was like stepping into another universe. Kyle wore his dress uniform, the dark blue of the United Earth Marines with gold buttons polished until they shined. At 28 years old, he was young for this assignment, but his record was perfect. 3 years on the Mars Colony Security Detail, 2 years protecting shipping routes near Jupiter, and one very dangerous mission breaking up a pirate ring in the asteroid belt. He earned his place on this mission through hard work, not connections or money. Ambassador Patricia Crawford sat across from him, reviewing documents on her tablet. She was 56, with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been negotiating with alien species since before Kyle joined the military. Right now she looked worried, though she tried to hide it. The Viridians did not like humans very much. 15 years ago, humanity joined the Galactic Coalition, but many species still saw them as violent and primitive. Humans fought too much, moved too fast, and asked too many questions. The Viridians especially thought humans were crude and dangerous. They had been traveling between stars for thousands of years while humans were still learning to make fire. But Earth needed what the Viridians had. Deep in their empire were planets rich with rare minerals that made faster-than-light travel possible. Without those minerals, human ships would stay slow and limited. The ambassador was here to make a trade deal, and Kyle was here to keep her safe while she did it. The shuttle landed on a platform that seemed to float in the air. As Kyle stepped out, gravity felt slightly lighter than Earth normal, making each step feel like he might float away. The air smelled like flowers he had never encountered before, sweet but with something sharp underneath. It was late afternoon here, and the 2 suns were setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange that Earth never produced. A group of Viridians waited to greet them. Kyle had seen Viridians before, but only in recordings. In person, they were stunning. They looked almost human in shape, with 2 arms and 2 legs, but their skin was different. It shifted colors slowly, like oil on water, moving through shades of blue and silver and pearl. The one in front, clearly the leader, had skin that glowed with a soft golden light. Kyle noticed their eyes most of all. Where humans had white around colored irises, Viridians had eyes that glowed from within, like someone had placed stars behind colored glass. The leader's eyes were deep purple, and they looked at the human delegation with something between curiosity and distaste. The greeting ceremony was formal and cold. The Viridian diplomat, whose name Kyle could not pronounce, welcomed them with words that sounded polite but felt empty. Ambassador Crawford responded with equal formality. Kyle stood at attention, his hand never far from his weapon, though he knew using it would cause an intergalactic incident. They were taken to their quarters in the palace. The building was enormous, with ceilings so high Kyle could barely see them. The walls were made of crystal that changed color as he walked past, responding to movement or temperature or something he did not understand. His room was beautiful but sterile, like a museum display. Everything was perfect, but nothing felt warm. That evening there was a state dinner. Kyle had been to formal military events before, but this was different. The dining hall could have held 1,000 people easily. The table was carved from a single piece of crystal that seemed to glow from within. The Viridians who attended wore flowing robes that changed colors as they moved, and every one of them looked at the human guests like they were interesting but slightly disgusting insects. Kyle stood against the wall with the other security officers watching everything. His training kicked in automatically. He noted the exits, counted the guards, and looked for anything unusual. The Viridian Royal Guard stood around the room in their ceremonial armor, which looked more decorative than practical. They were tall, even for Viridians, and they moved with the confidence of warriors who had never been tested. Then she entered, and every conversation stopped. Empress Zaraketh of the Viridian Empire was young by her species' standards, Only 143 years old. She looked like she might be in her 20s by human measurement. Though Kyle knew that meant nothing with aliens, her skin glowed brighter than the others, shifting through colors that seemed to reflect light that was not there. From her head grew crystalline horns curving back like a crown, and her eyes glowed with light that was almost white. She was beautiful in a way that was completely alien and somehow familiar at the same time. She wore robes of deep blue that moved around her like water, and when she walked, everyone in the room seemed to lean toward her without meaning to. The dinner began with speeches that Kyle did not fully understand. The food was strange, things that looked like plants but moved slightly on the plate, liquids that changed color when poured. Kyle ate nothing as his orders specified. His job was to watch, not to enjoy himself. Halfway through the meal, something unexpected happened. The Empress stood and walked toward the human delegation. Everyone froze. This was not part of the planned ceremony. Her guards moved with her, staying close but looking uncomfortable with the deviation from protocol. She stopped in front of Ambassador Crawford and spoke in perfect English. Her voice was like music with harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere other than her throat. The two of them exchanged pleasantries about the negotiations and the importance of cooperation between species. Then, to everyone's surprise, the Empress turned to Kyle. She looked directly at him with those glowing eyes, and Kyle felt like she could see straight through him. Her skin shifted to shades of blue and silver, colors that he would later learn meant curiosity and interest. She asked him a question that seemed to come from nowhere. She wanted to know about Earth's oceans. She had read that humans loved the sea, that they wrote songs about it and painted pictures of it and missed it when they were away. She asked if Kyle loved the ocean. The question caught him completely off guard. No one had warned him that the Empress might speak to him directly. Diplomats did not usually ask security guards about their personal feelings, but something in her expression made him answer honestly instead of giving a formal response. He told her that he grew up far from the ocean, in a city of factories and concrete. But once, when he was 12, his mother had saved money for a year to take him to the Atlantic coast. They spent 3 days there, and Kyle remembered sitting on the sand watching waves that seemed to go on forever. He remembered thinking that the ocean was patient and powerful at the same time, that it had been there long before humans and would be there long after. The Empress listened to his entire answer, her skin shifting through colors that seemed to reflect emotion. When he finished, she smiled, and it was a real smile, not the diplomatic expression she had worn all evening. She thanked him for his honesty and returned to her seat. The dinner continued, but Kyle could feel eyes on him. The other Viridians looked confused and slightly offended that their Empress had spent time talking to a human guard. Ambassador Crawford looked worried, like Kyle had done something wrong. The Viridian Royal Guard looked angry, especially their commander, a massive warrior whose skin turned dark red when he looked at Kyle. After the dinner ended, Kyle did what he always did. He reviewed the evening in his mind, noting everything unusual. And there had been many unusual things. The route they took to the dining hall was different from the maps he had studied. Some of the servants had been changed at the last minute. 3 of the Royal Guard had been replaced by soldiers he did not recognize from the briefing materials. Small things, maybe meaningless. But Kyle's training taught him that small things could be warnings. He wrote a report and sent it to Ambassador Crawford, detailing his concerns about security irregularities. Her response came an hour later. She told him that he was being paranoid, that the Viridians had their own security protocols, and that humans needed to stop seeing threats everywhere. She ordered him to focus on his actual duties and stop making the delegation look suspicious and aggressive. Kyle read the message 3 times, then deleted it. He understood her position. The negotiations were delicate, and any suggestion that humans did not trust their hosts could ruin everything. But his instinct still screamed that something was wrong. That night, Kyle could not sleep. He stood at the window of his quarters, looking out at the crystal city glowing in the darkness. 2 moons hung in the sky, both larger than Earth's moon, casting strange shadows across the alien landscape. 3 days passed in a blur of formal meetings and careful conversations. Kyle spent his time watching and waiting, always standing at the edge of rooms while important people discussed things he barely understood. The trade negotiations moved slowly, with every word chosen carefully and every gesture analyzed for hidden meaning. On the fourth day, Kyle received new orders. The Empress was making a ceremonial visit to the Shrine of First Light, a sacred place where Viridian rulers went to seek guidance from their ancestors. It was an important tradition, and the human delegation was invited to observe from a respectful distance. Kyle would be part of the security detail watching the ceremony. He studied the route that morning, memorizing every turn and intersection. The shrine was located in the old quarter of the city, where the crystal towers grew even taller and closer together. The streets there were narrow, winding through canyons of glowing architecture that blocked out the sky. It was beautiful but also tactically problematic. Too many places for threats to hide, too few escape routes. When Kyle arrived at the assembly point, he noticed immediately that something was wrong. The route had been changed. Instead of taking the main ceremonial boulevard, which was wide and easily secured, they would be going through the narrow streets he had been worried about. No one had informed the human security team about this change. Kyle approached the senior Viridian security officer, a commander named Velthar. He was enormous even by Viridian standards, nearly 7 feet tall with skin that shifted between dark blue and steel gray. His crystalline horns were larger than the Empress's, curved and sharp, and his eyes glowed with a red that reminded Kyle of warning lights. Kyle asked about the route change, keeping his voice respectful but firm. Commander Velthar looked down at him with barely concealed contempt. His skin darkened to angry shades of red and black as he spoke. The commander told Kyle that Viridian security had been protecting their Empress for centuries, before humans learned to leave their planet. The route was chosen for reasons Kyle could not possibly understand. He should focus on following orders and stop questioning decisions made by his superiors. The way he said it made clear that he considered humans far from being true superiors to anyone. Kyle wanted to argue, but protocol prevented it. He was a guest here, and causing a scene would create exactly the kind of incident Ambassador Crawford had warned him about. So he nodded, stepped back, and watched. But he did not stop worrying. As the procession prepared to leave, Kyle saw other things that bothered him. Several guards who were supposed to be on duty had been replaced at the last minute. The communications equipment looked different from what he had seen before, and there were Viridian nobles in the crowd who kept looking at each other with expressions that seemed wrong, excited in a way that did not match the solemnity of a religious ceremony. One noble in particular caught Kyle's attention. He was older than most Viridians Kyle had seen, with skin that had darkened to a purple so deep it was almost black. His robes were expensive, marked with symbols that indicated high rank. But his eyes kept moving to the changed route markers, and twice Kyle saw him nod to guards who were not part of the official security detail. Kyle used his wrist computer to capture an image and ran it through the diplomatic database. The result made his stomach tighten. This was Duke Carvax, one of the most powerful nobles in the Viridian Empire. He came from an ancient bloodline that had ruled for thousands of years before the current Empress's family took power. According to the files, he was politically opposed to the Empress's progressive policies and especially against her interest in working with humans. Kyle sent another report to Ambassador Crawford, this one more urgent. He detailed the route change, the personnel substitutions, and Duke Carvax's presence and behavior. He recommended that the human delegation skip the ceremony and return to their secured quarters until the situation could be assessed. The ambassador's response was swift and angry. She told Kyle that he was seeing conspiracies where none existed, that his paranoia was exactly why many species considered humans too aggressive and suspicious to trust. The negotiations were at a critical point. One more incident like this, and she would have him removed from the mission and sent back to Earth. He was ordered to stand down, follow protocol, and stop embarrassing the human delegation. Kyle read the message and felt frustration burn in his chest. He was not being paranoid. He was doing exactly what his training had taught him to do. But he also understood that he was just a lieutenant, and the ambassador was right about one thing. If he caused problems, it would reflect badly on all of humanity. So he did what soldiers do. He followed his orders and hoped he was wrong about everything. The procession began in the early afternoon. The Empress rode in an open vehicle that floated above the ground, surrounded by her royal guard in their gleaming ceremonial armor. She wore white robes that seemed to glow with their own light, and her crystalline crown caught the double sunlight and scattered it in rainbow patterns. She looked like something from a dream, beautiful and remote and untouchable. The human delegation followed at a respectful distance in their own transport. Kyle stood at the rear, his eyes constantly moving, his hand resting near his weapon. Other human security officers stood with him, but they seemed relaxed, enjoying the spectacle of the alien ceremony. Only Kyle remained tense, watching for threats that everyone told him did not exist. The procession entered the narrow streets of the old quarter, and Kyle's worry increased with every block. The crystal towers rose on either side like cliffs, blocking out most of the sunlight. Shadows pooled in doorways and alleys. The crowds that lined the route were thick and difficult to monitor. It was a security nightmare. Halfway through the old quarter, something unexpected happened. A small child, a young Viridian with skin that still shifted through bright, innocent colors, broke through the crowd barrier. He ran toward the Empress's vehicle, holding something in his small hands. It looked like flowers, the kind that children might pick for someone important. The royal guard reacted instantly, weapons rising, bodies moving to intercept the child. But the Empress raised her hand, stopping them. She smiled at the child and lowered her vehicle so she could receive his gift. It was a kind gesture, the sort of thing that would make people love their ruler. But Kyle was not watching the child. He was watching the guards, and he saw something that made his blood run cold. While everyone's attention was on the Empress and the child, 3 of the guards were moving into new positions. Their hands were near their weapons and their eyes were not on the child at all. They were watching the crystal towers above, waiting for something. Kyle's training took over. He activated his communicator and tried to send a warning, but the channel was jammed. Dead static filled his ear. Someone was blocking communications. That was not an accident. That was deliberate. He looked up at the towers and saw movement on one of the high balconies. Sunlight reflected off something metallic, a weapon. Kyle opened his mouth to shout a warning, but at that moment, the Empress finished talking to the child and her vehicle began to rise again. The procession started moving forward. Kyle made a decision that went against every order he had been given. He jumped from the human transport and started running toward the Empress's vehicle. He heard Ambassador Crawford shouting behind him, heard other security officers calling his name, but he did not stop. He reached the Empress's vehicle just as she turned to look at him. Her eyes widened in surprise. The royal guards moved to block him, but they were too slow. Kyle was not trying to reach the Empress. He was looking up at the towers, his weapon already in his hand. And then the world exploded into violence. Energy weapons fire erupted from a dozen positions in the towers above. Bright blue bolts of superheated plasma screamed down into the street. The first volley struck the royal guard, and Kyle watched in horror as ceremonial armor that was designed more for beauty than protection melted under the assault. Guards fell, screaming. The crowd panicked, people running in every direction. More weapons fire came from the surrounding buildings, creating a kill zone with the Empress at its center. This was not a random attack. This was a carefully planned assassination. The royal guard, the elite warriors who were supposed to protect their Empress with their lives, broke and ran. Kyle watched in disbelief as Commander Velthar, the same officer who had mocked human security concerns, threw down his ceremonial weapon and sprinted for cover. Other guards followed, their courage evaporating the moment real danger appeared. In seconds, the Empress stood alone. Her vehicle had been hit and crashed to the ground. She climbed out, stumbling, her white robes already stained with dust and blood from wounded guards. Energy bolts struck the ground around her feet, sending up sprays of crystal fragments. Kyle heard Ambassador Crawford's voice over the emergency channel, ordering all humans to retreat to the transports. It was the right call. This was not their fight. They were guests here, and getting involved in Viridian politics could cause an intergalactic crisis. Every piece of training and protocol said Kyle should follow orders, get to safety, and let the Viridians handle their own problems. Kyle counted his remaining ammunition and did not like the answer. 12 shots left in his sidearm. No backup weapon, no additional magazines because this was supposed to be a ceremonial detail. His combat armor had stopped the first killing shot, but it was cracked and would not hold against another direct hit. Every breath sent pain through his broken ribs and he could taste blood in his mouth. Behind him, pressed against his back, the Empress was silent except for her breathing. Her skin had turned almost white, colors fading in what Kyle guessed was shock. He had thrown them both behind the wreckage of her vehicle, but it would not provide cover for long. Energy weapons were already melting through the metal. Kyle looked around, his tactical training taking over despite the pain. The street was a killing zone. Bodies of royal guards who had not run fast enough lay scattered on the crystal pavement. The crowd had fled, leaving only the attackers and their targets. Kyle counted at least 8 shooters in the towers above, maybe more hidden in positions he could not see. The human transport was gone. Ambassador Crawford had followed protocol and evacuated. Kyle's communicator still received only static. They had jammed all frequencies. No one was coming to help. He and the Empress were alone. An energy bolt struck near Kyle's head, sending crystal fragments flying. One cut his cheek and he felt warm blood run down his face. He fired back, his shot precise despite the pain. An attacker fell from a balcony above, his weapon clattering on the street. Kyle felt the Empress flinch behind him at the violence. He spoke to her without turning around, keeping his eyes on the towers. His voice was calm, the same tone he used during training exercises. He told her that they needed to move. This position would not hold much longer. He asked if there was anywhere close where they could take better cover. He spoke like this was a normal situation, like they were discussing dinner plans instead of fighting for their lives. The Empress's voice shook when she answered. She pointed to a building across the street, an old structure with thick crystal walls. It was a shrine keeper's residence, she said, and it had security doors that could seal against attack. But getting there meant crossing open ground while shooters aimed at them from above. Kyle studied the distance. Maybe 30 feet. Too far to run while protecting someone. Too far to make it without getting hit. But staying here guaranteed death while moving gave them a chance. Sometimes a small chance was all you got. He explained what they were going to do. When he said go, she would run straight for that door and not look back. He would provide covering fire and follow her. She started to argue, started to say something about him going first, but Kyle cut her off. His tone was not harsh, but it left no room for debate. He told her that he was a soldier and this was his job. He told her that if she wanted to help him, she would run fast and not hesitate. Then he took 3 deep breaths, counted down from 3, and shouted for her to go. The Empress ran. Her white robe streamed behind her, and her crystalline crown caught the light as she sprinted across the open street. Kyle stepped out from cover and started firing. He did not aim to kill now. He aimed to make the attackers duck, to make them think twice about leaning out to shoot. His weapon barked steadily, each shot placed exactly where it needed to be. Energy bolts answered his fire, and Kyle felt one graze his left arm. His armor sleeve melted and pain seared through muscle. He ignored it and kept shooting. He watched the Empress reach the door and start working the lock panel. She was safe for the moment. Now he needed to get there himself. Kyle's weapon clicked empty. He threw it aside and ran. Pain exploded through his ribs with each step, and his wounded arm hung useless at his side. Energy bolts struck the ground around his feet, sending up fountains of melted crystal. One bolt hit his back armor and he felt it fail, felt the heat burn through to his skin. He stumbled but kept moving. The door was 10 feet away, then 5. The Empress had it open, and she was reaching for him, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself but for him. Kyle threw himself through the doorway just as another bolt struck where his head had been a moment before. They collapsed together on the floor inside. The Empress immediately pressed her hand against a wall panel, and heavy security doors slammed shut. The sound of energy weapons fire became muffled. For a moment they just lay there, both breathing hard, both alive when they should not be. Kyle forced himself to sit up, assessing their situation. They were in a small room with walls of thick crystal that glowed with dim internal light. There was one door leading deeper into the building. No other exits visible. No weapons except what the attackers outside had, and Kyle had no way to get to those. He looked down at himself and saw he was bleeding from multiple wounds. The burn on his back hurt worse than anything else, but the cuts from crystal fragments were numerous and deep. His combat armor was destroyed, hanging off him in melted pieces. He started removing it, working with his good hand while his left arm throbbed with every movement. The Empress knelt beside him. Her hands reached out to help, then hesitated like she had never actually touched anyone without permission before. Kyle nodded to her, and she started helping him remove the ruined armor. Her hands were shaking, but her touch was gentle. She told him that she had medical training, basic emergency care that all Viridian royalty learned. She moved to examine his wounds, and Kyle let her. He had no medical supplies. and his own training was limited to battlefield first aid. He needed her help, and accepting help was not weakness. As she worked on his injuries, using supplies from an emergency kit she found on the wall, they could hear sounds outside, footsteps, voices speaking Viridian. The attackers were regrouping, preparing to breach the building. The security door would hold for a while, but not forever. The Empress finished bandaging his arm and sat back. Her skin was still pale, colors muted, but her hands had stopped shaking. She looked at Kyle, and her glowing eyes held questions. She asked him why he did it, why he ran toward her instead of away, why he stayed when even her own guards had fled. Her voice was quiet, confused, like she genuinely could not understand what would make someone act this way. Kyle leaned back against the crystal wall, trying to find a position that did not make his ribs scream. He thought about her question. It deserved an honest answer, even if he was not sure he fully understood his own reasons. He told her that leaving someone to die alone was not something he could do. He told her that his mother raised him to believe that your worth was measured by what you did when it was hard, not what you did when it was easy. Running away would have been easy. Running toward her was hard, so that was the choice he made. He also told her something else, something he had not planned to say. He told her that when she asked him about the ocean, he saw something in her eyes. Loneliness. The kind that came from being surrounded by people who wanted things from you, but did not see you. He understood that loneliness because he had felt it too, being the poor kid who did not fit in, being the human in places where humans were not wanted. He told her that maybe he stayed because nobody should die alone, but especially not someone who understood what it meant to be lonely in a crowd. The Empress listened to his words, and her skin began to shift colors again. Shades of blue and gold moved across her like waves. Kyle would later learn these colors meant gratitude and something like affection, but in that moment he just saw her becoming less like a statue and more like a person. She told him about her life, how she became Empress when she was barely considered an adult by Viridian standards, how her mother had been killed by people who opposed change and progress, how every day since then, she had worn a crown that felt like a weight trying to crush her, how she was surrounded by advisors and guards and servants, but she could not trust any of them completely. How being Empress meant being alone even in a palace full of people. She told him that when she asked about the ocean, she was really asking if he understood what it felt like to be small and powerless against something vast, and his answer told her that he did understand. That was why she remembered him. That was why when her guards ran and everyone abandoned her, she was not completely surprised that the one who stayed was the human who understood oceans. Kyle listened to her words and realized that he was seeing something few people ever saw. The Empress behind the crown, the person behind the position. She was not that different from him, really. Both of them trying to do jobs that were too big, both of them lonely, both of them hoping to be more than what other people expected. Outside, something heavy hit the security door. The attackers were beginning their breach. Time was running out. Kyle tried to stand and pain made him gasp. The Empress moved to help him, her hands supporting his weight. Together, they managed to get him upright. She told him there was a deeper level to this building, ancient tunnels that connected to other parts of the old quarter. If they could reach the tunnels, they might be able to escape. But Kyle could barely walk and she could not carry him. They would have to move slowly and the attackers would breach the door soon. Kyle looked at the door leading deeper into the building, then back at the security door that was beginning to glow where energy weapons were. Kyle woke to darkness and pain. For a moment he could not remember where he was or what had happened. Then memory crashed back like a wave. The attack, the running, the Empress. He tried to sit up and gasped as every injury protested at once. A soft glow appeared beside him. The Empress held something that looked like a crystal sphere, and it gave off gentle blue light. In that light, Kyle could see they were in a tunnel carved from stone so old it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The air was cool and smelled like dust and age. The Empress had torn strips from her white robes and used them to bandage his shoulder where the energy weapon had grazed him. She had also found water somewhere, and she helped him drink. The water tasted mineral and strange, but Kyle was too thirsty to care. She told him he had been unconscious for about 10 minutes. She had used her crown to send an emergency signal, but she did not know if it got through. The ancient tunnels interfered with communications. They needed to keep moving, to get closer to the surface where a signal might reach the palace. But first, she wanted to make sure he could walk. Kyle tested his body carefully. His ribs were definitely broken, maybe 3 or 4 of them. His left arm was burned and cut. His shoulder had a deep graze that would have been much worse if the energy bolt had struck directly. He had lost blood and probably had a concussion from when he hit the ground. By any reasonable assessment, he should not be able to function. But Kyle had learned a long time ago that reasonable assessments did not always matter. Sometimes you had to move when moving seemed impossible. Sometimes you had to keep going because stopping meant dying. He pushed himself to his feet, using the tunnel wall for support, and nodded to the Empress. They walked through the darkness, the crystal sphere providing just enough light to see a few feet ahead. The tunnels branched and turned in ways that seemed random, but the Empress navigated with confidence. She explained that all Viridian children learned these tunnels as part of their history education. They were thousands of years old, built when her people were not so different from humans, when they still feared the dark and needed safe places to hide. Kyle listened to her talk, grateful for the distraction from pain. He asked her about Duke Carvax, about why someone would want to kill her. She was quiet for a moment, her skin shifting to darker colors that Kyle was learning meant sadness or anger. She told him that the Duke represented the old ways of thinking. He believed Viridians were superior to all other species, that they should remain isolated and pure. When her mother began opening diplomatic relations with other species, including humans, the Duke and others like him saw it as betrayal. They killed her mother in a bombing that was made to look like an accident. The Empress had known about the conspiracy, she admitted. She had been gathering evidence, trying to identify all the traitors before moving against them. She thought she had more time. She thought her guards were loyal. She was wrong about both, and now she was paying the price for that mistake. Kyle understood mistakes. He had made plenty of his own. He told her that intelligence was never perfect, that you made the best decisions you could with what you knew. She had survived, which meant she still had a chance to fix things. That was more than many people got. They came to a place where the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Ancient columns carved with symbols Kyle could not read held up a ceiling lost in darkness. Water dripped somewhere, echoing in the vast space. The Empress paused, consulting her mental map of the tunnels. While she decided which path to take, Kyle allowed himself to rest against one of the columns. His body was reaching its limits. The adrenaline that had kept him moving was fading, and exhaustion was taking its place. He needed medical attention soon, real medical attention, not just bandages torn from robes. The Empress came back to him, and she must have seen something in his face because her expression changed. She knelt beside him, her glowing eyes examining him with concern that went beyond formal politeness. Her hand touched his forehead, and she made a sound that Kyle guessed was a curse in her language. She told him he had a fever. Infection was starting in his wounds, probably from the crystal fragments that had cut him. Viridian crystal sometimes carried bacteria that human immune systems could not fight. He needed antibiotics, specialized ones for cross-species contamination. Without them, the infection would spread quickly. Kyle tried to make a joke about it, something about surviving assassins only to be killed by sparkly rocks, but the Empress did not smile. She looked genuinely scared, and Kyle realized that she was not used to feeling helpless. All her life, she had resources and people to solve problems. Now she was alone with someone dying, and there was nothing she could do. He told her it was okay. He told her that he knew the risks when he made his choice. He told her not to blame herself for injuries he earned protecting her. If he had to do it again, he would make the same choice. That was the truth, and he wanted her to know it. The Empress shook her head, her skin flashing colors rapidly. She told him that she would not accept his death. She told him that she was an empress, and she commanded him to live. She told him that after everything he had done, after all the times he saved her, she would not let him die in a dark tunnel far from his home. There was something in her voice that made Kyle pay attention despite the fever fog in his brain. This was not just concern for someone who had helped her. This was personal. This was someone who had spent her life alone discovering what it felt like to have someone who understood her, and now that person was slipping away. Kyle reached up and touched her face, a gesture that probably broke a dozen rules about touching royalty. Her skin was warm and smooth and felt more human than he expected. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. He told her that she was not alone anymore. He told her that what happened today would change things. The galaxy had seen her guards run while a human stayed. They had seen courage and cowardice, and everyone would have to reconsider what they thought they knew about both species. Something good would come from this, even if he did not survive to see it. The Empress opened her eyes, and they were glowing brighter than before. She told him that he would survive to see it because she was going to make sure of it. She stood and helped him to his feet. She chose a tunnel, and they started walking again, faster now, urgency driving them forward. As they walked, she talked to keep him conscious. She told him about her dreams for the Viridian Empire, how she wanted to open their worlds to trade and cultural exchange, how she believed that species learned from each other and grew stronger together, how her people's isolation had made them arrogant and stagnant, how humans, with all their chaos and emotion and fierce loyalty, represented exactly what Viridians needed to see. Kyle listened and offered his own thoughts when he could. He told her about Earth, about its problems and beauty. He told her about cities full of millions of different people trying to live together. He told her about art and music and food from hundreds of cultures all mixing together. He told her about the factory workers in Detroit who taught him that dignity had nothing to do with what job you did or how much money you had. They talked about loneliness and duty and the weight of trying to be better than what people expected. They talked about fear and courage and the moment when you decide that some things are worth dying for. They talked like people who had been through war together, which in a way they had. The tunnel began to slope upward. The Empress's crown, still in Kyle's hand, began to glow more brightly. That meant they were getting closer to the surface, to where its communication functions could work properly. Hope gave them both energy to keep moving. They reached another sealed door, and the Empress used her biometric codes to open it. Beyond was a chamber with emergency equipment stored against the walls. The Empress found a medical kit and immediately began treating Kyle's wounds properly. She worked with hands that no longer shook, with confidence that came from having a purpose and a goal. She found the antibiotics she needed and injected them directly into his bloodstream. She sealed his burns with medical gel that cooled the pain immediately. She set his ribs as best she could and wrapped them tight. She worked like someone who refused to accept failure, and Kyle found himself believing that maybe, just maybe, he would survive this after all. When she finished, she sat back and looked at him. Her skin had shifted to colors that looked almost like relief. She told him that the medicine would work quickly. Within an hour, the fever would break. Within a day, the infection would be gone. He would hurt for weeks, but he would live. Kyle thanked her, and she made a sound that might have been a laugh. She told him that she should be thanking him. He had saved her life at least 3 times today. Medicine was a small repayment for that debt. But Kyle shook his head. He told her it was not a debt. You did not help people because you wanted repayment. You helped people because they needed help and you could provide it. That was all. That was enough. The Empress studied him for a long moment. Then she did something that shocked him completely. She bowed to him, a deep formal bow that royalty never gave to anyone. When she straightened, her eyes were bright with emotion. Kyle woke in a hospital room that looked like it was carved from a single piece of crystal. Soft light came from the walls themselves, and the bed adjusted to his body in ways that were more comfortable than anything he had ever experienced. For a moment, he wondered if he was dead and this was some kind of afterlife. Then pain from his ribs reminded him that dead people probably did not hurt this much. Viridian medical officer noticed he was awake and immediately began checking displays that floated in the air above Kyle's bed. The officer spoke in careful English, telling Kyle that he had been unconscious for 18 hours. His injuries were healing well thanks to a combination of human and Viridian medical technology. The broken ribs were being knitted together with cellular regeneration. The burns were treated with synthetic skin. The infection was completely gone. The medical officer also told Kyle that he was lucky to be alive. Most humans would not have survived the amount of damage his body had taken, but Kyle had a stubborn constitution and apparently a reason to keep living that was stronger than normal biology. The officer did not elaborate, but Kyle caught the way he looked toward the door when he said it. Ambassador Crawford visited later that morning. She looked like she had not slept, her normally perfect appearance rumpled and tired. She sat in the chair beside Kyle's bed and was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. She told Kyle that she owed him an apology. She had dismissed his security concerns as paranoia. She had ordered him to stand down when his instincts were correct. She had prioritized political considerations over safety, and it almost cost the Empress her life. She had failed as a leader and she was sorry. Kyle listened and then told her something he had learned from his mother. Apologizing was important, but what you did after the apology mattered more. She had made mistakes, but she was here now, taking responsibility. That counted for something. The ambassador nodded, and something in her expression shifted from guilt to determination. She told Kyle that the situation had changed dramatically. Duke Carvax and his co-conspirators were in custody. The attack had been recorded by multiple sources, and the footage was spreading across the galaxy faster than anyone could control it. Everyone had seen the Royal Guard flee. Everyone had seen Commander Velthar abandon his Empress. And everyone had seen one human marine run toward danger when trained warriors ran away. The political implications were enormous. The ambassador told Kyle that he had become the most famous human in the galaxy overnight. His name was being discussed in government chambers on 100 worlds. Some praised him as a hero. Some criticized him for interfering in alien affairs. But nobody could ignore what he had done. Kyle felt uncomfortable with the idea of fame. He had not acted to become famous. He had acted because someone needed help, but he understood that his actions had meaning beyond his intentions. Sometimes what you did accidentally changed more than what you planned carefully. The ambassador also told him that the trade negotiations were complete. The Viridian Empire had agreed to terms that were far more favorable to humanity than anyone had hoped. The Empress herself had insisted on it, calling it the beginning of a true partnership between their peoples. Human access to rare minerals was guaranteed, and cultural exchange programs were being established. Kyle realized that his choice to stay had accomplished what months of careful diplomacy might not have. By showing that humans could be loyal and brave and selfless, he had broken through prejudices that words alone could not touch. It was not the way anyone would have planned it, but results mattered more than methods. After the ambassador left, Kyle had other visitors. Marines from his unit came by to congratulate him and tell him he was insane for what he did. They said it with respect, though, the kind that soldiers gave to someone who had done something they were not sure they would have had the courage to do themselves. Human civilians working in the embassy came too, wanting to shake his hand and thank him for making humanity look good. Kyle was polite to all of them, but he felt strange about the attention. He kept thinking about the royal guards who had run, about Commander Velthar's fear. Those were real people who had failed in a moment of crisis. He had succeeded, but that did not make him better than them. It just meant he had been tested differently. On his third day in the hospital, the Empress came to visit. She entered without announcement, just walking in like a normal person instead of royalty. She wore simple robes instead of her ceremonial clothing, and her crown was absent. She looked younger without it, less like a ruler and more like the person Kyle had talked to in the dark tunnels. She sat in the chair beside his bed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she reached out and took his hand, and her skin shifted to colors that Kyle was learning to read. Blue for calm, gold for happiness, a touch of green that meant something like friendship or affection. She told him that Duke Carvax had confessed to everything. The conspiracy went deeper than anyone had suspected, involving members of the military and several prominent noble families. But with the Empress alive and the attack exposed, the conspiracy had collapsed. Trials were beginning and justice would be served. Commander Velthar had been found hiding in a storage facility near the palace. He had surrendered without resistance. His rank and titles had been stripped away and his family name was disgraced. In Viridian culture, cowardice in the face of duty was one of the worst crimes imaginable. Velthar would live, but his life as he knew it was over. The Empress told Kyle that she felt no satisfaction from Velthar's fall. She had trusted him and he had failed her. But more than that, He had revealed something about Viridian society that was uncomfortable to face. They had become so focused on ceremony and appearance that they had forgotten the substance underneath. Their elite warriors were trained for parade grounds more than battlefields. Their superiority was assumed rather than earned. Kyle told her that every society had those problems. Humans had their own failures and hypocrisies. The difference was not whether you had problems, but whether you were willing to face them and change. She had that willingness. That meant something could be better. The Empress smiled at his words. She told him that she was rebuilding the Royal Guard from scratch. New standards, new training, new expectations, and she was modeling those standards on what Kyle had done. Loyalty to the person, not just the position. Courage when it mattered, not just when it was safe. Service that meant something beyond ceremony. She told him something else too. The Galactic Coalition was in an uproar over what had happened. Species that had dismissed humans as barely civilized were now having to reconsider. The footage of Kyle protecting her was being used in debates about what defined an advanced civilization. Was it technology? Was it age? Or was it character and courage? Kyle listened and felt the weight of that responsibility. He represented more than just himself now. Every action he took would be watched and judged. Every word he said would be analyzed for what it meant about humanity. It was exhausting to think about, and he said so. The Empress understood. She told him that she had lived with that weight her entire adult life. Every choice she made affected billions of people. Every mistake had consequences that rippled across worlds. It was lonely and frightening, and sometimes she wanted to just be a person instead of a symbol. But then she smiled and squeezed his hand. She told him that at least now she had someone who understood. Someone who had seen past her crown to the person underneath. Someone who had protected her not because he had to, but because he chose to. That meant more to her than any ceremony or reward could express. Kyle felt something shift in his chest, something that had nothing to do with broken ribs. He looked at this alien Empress with her glowing eyes and color-shifting skin, and he realized that species differences did not matter as much as he had thought. Loneliness was loneliness. Understanding was understanding. Connection was connection. These things transcended biology. The Empress told him that in 3 days there would be a formal ceremony. She would be awarding him the Star of Zalthara, the highest honor the Viridian Empire could give. He would be the first human to ever receive it. The ceremony would be broadcast across the galaxy, and important people from dozens of worlds would attend. She asked if he felt ready for that. Kyle thought about it honestly. He did not feel ready. He did not feel like a hero or someone who deserved galactic attention. He felt like a soldier who had made a choice in a moment of crisis, nothing more. But he also understood that his feelings did not matter as much as what his actions represented. If his story could help humans be seen as equals in the galaxy, if it could help break down prejudices and build connections, then he had a duty to participate in that ceremony. Sometimes being a soldier meant fighting. Sometimes it meant standing in front of cameras and accepting medals you did not feel you earned. He told the Empress he would be there. She smiled and her skin glowed brighter. She told him she never doubted he would. Then she stood to leave, but she paused at the door. She told him one more thing. After the ceremony, she wanted to make him an offer. She wanted him to consider staying on Zalthara Prime as part of her new royal guard. Not as a ceremonial position, but as a real. The Grand Hall of the Viridian Palace had never held so many different species at once. Kyle stood at the entrance, looking out at an audience that represented dozens of worlds. There were Viridians, of course, thousands of them filling the crystal galleries. But there were also tall gray figures from the Zenith Collective, small furred beings from the Kalos Union, and representatives from at least 20 other species Kyle could not identify. And in the front row, transmitted live via hologram, his mother sat in her small Detroit apartment. Kyle had spoken to her the night before, and she had cried when she saw him. She told him she was proud. She told him his father would have been proud too. She told him to stand up straight and remember that he represented more than just himself. Kyle wore his dress uniform, the one he had polished until it gleamed. His ribs still hurt and his arm was still bandaged under his sleeve, but he stood straight. He had practiced this walk a dozen times, but now that the moment was here, his heart was racing. Ambassador Crawford stood beside him, wearing formal diplomatic robes. She leaned over and whispered that he should breathe. Kyle realized he had been holding his breath and let it out slowly. She smiled at him, and he was grateful for her presence. Despite their rough start, she had become someone he respected. Music began, something that sounded like wind chimes mixed with distant thunder. The ceremony was starting. Kyle walked forward, his steps measured and precise. Every eye in the hall followed him. Every camera in the galaxy focused on this moment. The Empress waited at the far end of the hall, standing on a raised platform of crystal that seemed to float in the air. She wore robes of deep blue that seemed to contain stars, and her crown caught the light from 100 directions. She looked like something from a dream, powerful and beautiful and completely out of reach. But then Kyle saw her eyes, and he saw the person behind the ceremony. He saw the woman who had bandaged his wounds in darkness. He saw someone who understood loneliness and duty and the weight of expectations. He saw his friend. Kyle reached the platform and stopped at the bottom step. The Empress spoke, her voice amplified so that everyone in the hall and everyone watching across the galaxy could hear. She spoke in formal Viridian first. Words that Kyle had been taught meant honor and courage and sacrifice. Then she switched to English so that humans everywhere could understand. She told the story of the attack. She described how her guards had fled and how one human soldier had stood his ground. She described the fighting and the running and the moments when death seemed certain. She described Kyle's courage not as something superhuman, but as something profoundly human. The choice to protect someone who needed protection even when the cost was high. She held up the Star of Zalthara, a metal made of crystal that glowed with internal light. She explained that this honor had been given only 12 times in Viridian history, always to warriors who had shown extraordinary valor. Kyle would be the 13th recipient and the first from any species other than Viridian. She invited Kyle to approach. He climbed the steps, his heart pounding, trying to remember the formal responses he had been taught. But when he reached her, standing close enough to see the colors shifting in her skin, the formal words disappeared from his mind. The Empress placed the medal around his neck. The crystal was warm against his chest, and it seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. She spoke the formal words of the ceremony, but her eyes were saying something different. They were saying thank you. They were saying, you changed everything. They were saying, please stay. Kyle responded with the formal acceptance in Viridian, words he had practiced until they were perfect. Then he added something that was not part of the script. He thanked her for trusting him. He thanked her for showing him that courage came in many forms, including the courage to keep hoping when hope seemed impossible. The hall erupted in sound. Viridians did not clap like humans did. They made a sound like crystal chiming, musical and strange and beautiful. Mixed in with it were the sounds of other species showing approval in their own ways. The noise was overwhelming and wonderful at the same time. The ceremony continued with speeches from various officials. The human ambassador spoke about the new partnership between Earth and the Viridian Empire. The Galactic Coalition representative talked about how this event would change perceptions across civilized space. Military officers from both species discussed what Kyle's actions meant for the future of security and cooperation. Kyle stood through it all, trying to look dignified, while his ribs ached and his mind wandered. He kept thinking about the conversation he needed to have with the Empress. He had made his decision about her offer, but he had not told anyone yet. After the ceremony ended, there would be time to talk. There would be time to explain what he had decided and why. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the ceremony concluded. The crowd began to disperse, though many lingered to stare at Kyle or try to speak with him. Ambassador Crawford ran interference, politely directing people away and giving Kyle space to breathe. The Empress caught his eye and gestured toward a side exit. Kyle followed her through corridors that grew quieter as they moved away from the public spaces. They ended up in the same crystal garden where they had first spoken honestly. Weeks ago, when everything had been simpler. She removed her ceremonial crown and set it on a bench, then sat beside it. She looked tired, like the weight of the ceremony had been heavy. Kyle sat beside her, careful of his ribs, and for a moment they just breathed in the perfumed air of alien flowers. The Empress spoke first. She asked if he had thought about her offer. She told him that she would understand if he said no. She told him that what she was asking was enormous, that it would change his entire life, that there would be difficulties and complications neither of them could predict. Kyle listened to her talk, hearing the nervousness under her formal words. She was scared he would refuse. She was scared of being alone again. She was scared that the connection they had formed was temporary, born of crisis and destined to fade when normal life resumed. Kyle interrupted her gently. He told her that he had an answer. He told her that he had thought about it carefully, weighing all the factors. He told her about calling his mother and asking for advice. He told her about lying awake at night, imagining different futures and trying to decide which one felt right. Then he told her his answer. He would accept her offer. He would stay on Zalthara Prime and join her royal guard. He would be the bridge between humans and Viridians, the proof that cooperation was possible. He would protect her not because he was ordered to, but because he wanted to. The Empress's skin flashed through colors so quickly that Kyle could not identify them all. Joy, relief, hope, and something deeper that he was only beginning to understand. She reached out and took his hand, and this time there was nothing formal about the gesture. This was person to person, friend to friend, maybe something more than friend given time. She told him that she was happy. She told him that she had been preparing herself for disappointment, that she had not dared to hope he would say yes. She told him that his presence would make everything easier, that knowing he was there would help her face the challenges ahead. Kyle told her that he was not staying just for duty. He told her that in the darkness of those tunnels fighting for survival, he had discovered something important. He had discovered that connection mattered more than comfort. That understanding someone deeply was rare and precious, that he wanted to see where this path led, even though it was unknown and probably difficult. He told her something else too, something he had realized while standing in that ceremony hall. When everyone else had been watching him receive a medal, he had been watching her. When everyone else had been thinking about politics and symbolism, he had been thinking about the person who understood oceans and loneliness. He told her that maybe his feelings were complicated by adrenaline and shared trauma. Maybe they would fade when life became routine. But maybe they would not. Maybe what he felt was real and would grow stronger. He wanted the chance to find out. The Empress listened to his words and tears formed in her glowing eyes. Viridian tears were like liquid crystal, catching light and scattering rainbows. She told him that she felt the same way. She told him that she had been so lonely for so long that she had forgotten what connection felt like. He had reminded her. They sat together in the garden as the double sun set, talking about the future. Kyle would need to formally resign from the human military and transfer to Viridian service. There would be paperwork and protocols and political discussions. His mother would worry, and he would need to visit Earth regularly to reassure her. There would be people who disapproved of a human guarding the Empress, and people who thought the Empress should not trust an alien so completely. But there would also be opportunity. A chance to build something new between species. A chance to prove that cooperation worked. A chance to write a story about two people from different worlds who found common ground and built on it. Kyle thought about his life before this mission. Simple, predictable, safe. He thought about the life ahead of him now. Complex, uncertain, probably difficult, but also exciting and meaningful and full of possibilities.